All right, Church and History class, here we are on chapter 13. You'll notice that this does not have a date on it, and that's because when we're talking about monasticism, we're talking about something that started pretty early in the church, really even before the time of the Nicene uh, Creed, Council of Nicaea, AD 325. So it even starts before then, but it really begins to dominate in the Middle Ages, which is why this chapter is here. And of course, the Cluny reform is something that starts at the beginning of the 10th century and continues for the next couple of centuries. All right, so he begins by talking about, you've had this objective movement of something called Christianity, but the question of sincerity, it's always a difficult one to grasp. Jesus confronts hypocrites. Just because somebody was identified as a Jew didn't mean that they were a true Jew. And Paul talks about one who is a Jew outwardly versus one who is a Jew inwardly in Romans chapter 2. But even those who are genuine, no church is perfect. He mentions the episode with Ananias and Sapphira, who appeared to be hypocritical. They had said they had sold a piece of land for a certain amount, and they hadn't done that. They had kept some of the money back for themselves, and God struck them dead through the Apostle Peter. And then you had Simon Magus. I think we talked to him a little bit last chapter. He's in Acts chapter 8, and the term simony goes back to him because he wanted to buy the Holy Spirit when he saw Peter lay hands on the Samaritans in Acts chapter 8. But again, so no church is perfect, no Christian is perfect. Even those who have genuine faith, we're always going to be battling what we call indwelling sin. And so the question is what do you do with that? How do you judge Christianity based on the fact that you have a lot of people not living up to the claims that Christianity makes? Some think Romans 7 is about the ongoing battle with sin. Other people think that it's talking about Paul before he was a Christian, Romans 7:14 to 25. So, shortcomings of the church, people both inside and outside had always found much fault with it. And there are genuine hypocrites, right? And of course, you could say everybody's a hypocrite if nobody lives up to the standards of Christ. But, the Bible does talk about the fact that the new covenant writes God's law in our hearts. And so, those who have genuine faith are going to begin to make progress. And if you want, you could review your catechism questions on sanctification. I think it's around, question 30, 34, 35. What benefits do believers receive in this life? Justification, adoption, sanctification. But again, it's always going to be imperfect. So this problem of the ongoing imperfection in the institutional church and in the lives of many people identified as Christians leads to the growth of asceticism and monasticism. Okay, and the book mentions how this goes back to chapter 6. This developed quite early in the history of the church. And again, it's a reaction to this reality that people are not living up to these standards. Now, we do need to realize that the Bible does say that we must deny ourselves, and that's going to take an extreme form in monasticism. And so we had the develop of asceticism. Asceticism is, again, kind of an extreme form of self-denial that usually refers to certain practices involving the body, where you're going to say no to certain foods or certain drink or certain activities like marriage. Extreme self-denial. And asceticism is not just something that happened in Christianity. Asceticism is common to many religions. You can see it in certain facets of Islam. You can see it in certain facets of Eastern religions, Buddhism, etc. So it's common to many religions. You could say there's a biblical form of asceticism when you look at the the Nazarites in the book of Leviticus, of which Samson is perhaps the most obvious biblical example. And of course, he failed. You know, he was kind of a, in some ways, you could say he was kind of a hypocrite of his Nazarite vows. So early on, we had the Desert Fathers, and you may have heard about them, Simeon Stylites, and I think there was a guy named Anthony. And this is what led to Eremitic monasticism in the Egyptian desert. And these guys, this is where we get the term hermit from, Eremitic. And that was very much an isolationist kind of monasticism. But then you have the development. This is the book on page 92 calls this the cloister life. The technical term is Cenobitic monasticism. And this is where you gather together with a community and you live as brothers. They called each other brothers, you know, brother John or brother Anthony. And they had a father abbot. Okay, Abba is a Aramaic word that means father. You can find it a few times in the New Testament. And so he would be kind of the guy in charge, and you'd have this communal life that would develop. And they took vows of poverty, celibacy, and obedience. You would obey the father abbot, you'd obey the guy higher than you in the chain, you would not own property individually, which of course wasn't very common in those days anyway, right? Unless you were a lord, and even he had to answer to the king. But also celibacy. You know, in other words, what came to be viewed as the ideal life is somebody who is not involved in marital relations. Some of this kind of comes from 1 Corinthians 7, what Paul says about his single life, whether he was ever married or whether he was a widower at the time that he became an apostle. It often involved periods of fasting. You know, all Christians were supposed to fast during times of Lent and Advent, but then there was more rigorous fasting that monks and nuns were engaged in. By the way, monk is the term for a male, and then a nun is the term for the female. Self-flagellation, again, there's this language in the Bible about putting to death the deeds of the body, and some people thought that that actually involved physically harming yourself in order to do that. It was, in other words, it's kind of taking fasting to another level in terms of punishing your own body. And again, it's kind of a misunderstanding, I think, personally, of what Paul says about buffeting my body. Now, again, there is a sense in which we need to do that. We need to deny impulses. We'll talk about this a little bit more as we get into the next section. Prayer, reading, meditation. Again, the Bible commends these things, and we need to do these things. You know, every Christian needs to. And then as the end of this section talks about, you need to have, there was the development of monastic orders. In other words, there was a certain monastery that would start, people liked it, so somebody like Benedict would write a rule so that other abbeys could start, other monasteries could start. And so you had Benedictine, Augustinian, and then we're eventually going to get into some more late Middle Ages ones that we'll talk about later, like Cistercian and Franciscan and Dominican. And then you'll also have the Jesuits develop during the Reformation period as part of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. So here's a picture of flagellation, and this is obviously a drawing of what it was like in the Middle Ages. You can see some actually contemporary pictures, some Shiite Muslims and things like that. Okay, the book asserts that monasticism is based on error. Again, this book is a Protestant book, and I think I generally agree with the author. I do think we need to recognize the positive good. As the book says, they rendered great services to the cause of civilization. They were places of hospitality. If you were traveling, this was not a time when you could just pull up your app and reserve a room online during your travels. And so monasteries often would allow you to spend a night or two when you were in the midst of your travels. So they were kind of like the medieval hotels in some ways. And you could see the word hospital in hospitality. They were often the place you would go to receive medical attention as well. They, again, ora et labora, work and pray. Ora, pray, labora, work. So these became often very successful. Even though they took vows of poverty, they could often become very wealthy places, not only because of the patronage of the nobility, but also just because they were often had good work ethics, and so they ended up producing very, very well and contributed to the local economy. But primarily, I think the positive thing is the learning and legacy. We've talked about this in our world history class about how the Bible and other ancient texts were preserved by the monasteries. They were centers of learning. It was largely monks who aided in the Carolingian Renaissance of the 9th century and other times of learning. And even today, when you look at certain Catholic universities, it may be a Jesuit school or it may be tied to a particular monastic order, either in its founding or in its continuation. And of course, there's Protestant schools too, and they wouldn't have the exact same thing. By the way, you can find monasteries. I think I mentioned this in the world history class. You can find monasteries in our area over toward Manchester. So they're still around today. They're obviously not the kind of dominant force that they were in the Middle Ages, but they're still around. Now, the error is that you end up creating these two classes of Christian. Okay, you've got a higher class, the religious, who are these monks and nuns, if they're not already a priest, and then you've got everybody else. And again, there was that whole problem that we talked about in the world history class, where you weren't even technically a member of the church if you weren't an ordained person. So the only other route that you had to become sort of like a full-fledged member was through this religious life, this being part of a monastery. And often, like a nobleman, his one son would inherit and become the next duke. His other son, if he, since he couldn't inherit, would often kind of enter a monastery. And those are the guys who often became the abbots because they kind of had this higher education, this higher training, and then could eventually become bishops as well. And again, sometimes that wasn't such a good thing because they weren't as committed to the monastic life sometimes. So again, there was a lot of corruption in the church. So anyway, you had the religious, And the mistake here is thinking that geographical separation is going to produce actual separation from sin. Okay. The Bible says that every Christian, not just a certain class, is to fight against the world, the flesh, and the devil. And the Bible says that you can't leave this world, really, even though you may go into a separate monastery. 1 Corinthians 5, what have I to do with judging outsiders? Um, Now, again, the problem here is that you have this idea that everybody in the society is a Christian because they're all baptized. The problem, of course, is that you don't have everybody living that way. The problem that you had here is that you know, people weren't practicing because everybody in the society was supposed to be a Christian. The idea of church discipline became very lax. The idea of putting someone outside the church became very lax. And so I think that's part of why you had this development, this reaction to it that led to the development of monasticism, where there could be a set of discipline amongst a community of people. But again, it created all kinds of error. The book doesn't talk about this, but I think that part of the problem here is that you had the ongoing influence of Greek philosophy. There was confusion about what the terms flesh and spirit mean in the New Testament, because flesh in the New Testament is not referring really to our physical body, but it's referring to man outside of Christ, man in Adam, united to Adam, fallen in Adam, and encompassing our souls as well as our bodies. And so that's really the problem, is when you begin to view flesh and spirit as like um, physical existence versus non-physical existence. But that's not really what the Bible means by this. So when the Bible talks about the conflict between the flesh and the spirit, it's not talking about a conflict between physical things and non-physical things. You just look at the works of the flesh in Galatians chapter 5, and a lot of them are about envy. Well, envy is something you do with your mind and with your soul. It's not something it may be acted out in your body, or strife, or all kinds of things there that aren't talking about physical existence. In the same way, the fruit of the spirit, you do live that out in your physical existence. You show love to others. You express joy through your words and through your deeds. You express kindness through your body by doing things for other people. So again, the life of the spirit is not a disembodied thing. Another thing that was very influential was the fact that you had this decisive figure in Western Christianity, Augustine, and the fact that he put his concubine away rather than marrying her becomes very influential for the ideal of Christianity. Again, monasticism starts before Augustine, but I think the development of the rule of Saint Benedict around Augustine's time, the development of an Augustinian order, becomes very influential and contributed, I think, to this problem. Now, the book talks about how things declined in the 9th century among the monasteries. Again, there were some good things happening in the ninth. Nadir means low point, right, as opposed to apex or summit. There were some good things happening in the 9th century with the Carolingian Renaissance, but at least among several of the Benedictine and Augustinian monasteries, things were really fading off, that even though there's supposed to be this ideal of this religious life. And again, it just kind of shows how just because you set up the system, just because you live separately, doesn't mean you're going to avoid worldliness. You can try to leave the world, but that doesn't mean that the world leaves you. Okay? So the rest of the Christians, again, not true members of the church, but baptized, they're kind of taught that you can't really live up to the true Christian life that's laid out in the New Testament unless you become a priest or you become one of these religious figures. And so I think that leads to people not even striving as hard as they should, not recognizing the words of Jesus that say that, um, you are to deny yourself, you are to um, um, crucify uh, your flesh um, in order to live. Let us put to death Romans 8:12. Let us put to death the deeds of the body by the Spirit, that we might live. And if we don't, we won't live. So, uh, so they're taught that they need to observe the rites of the church, right? Participate in these seven sacraments, the sacramental system. You are born, you get baptized. Later on, you're confirmed. You affirm your faith publicly. Perhaps you get married, which is another sacrament. If you become a priest, you get ordained, right? These seven sacraments that we've talked about. But again, there wasn't much emphasis on actual practical holiness. I'm sure there was some teaching about this. And again, the book may be overdrawing some of this, because again, Christ says, I will build my church. So we got to be careful about um, overdrawing this, but there is something about when you have this systemic doctrinal view that there's two classes of Christians, it does lead to a lot of problems. So you have what we might call nominal Christianity. The nominal case is the naming case. So it's someone in name only. You're baptized, so therefore you are publicly designated a Christian. You're not a Muslim, you're not a Jew, you're not a Buddhist. And there's always been nominal Christianity around. The problem is that in the Middle Ages it almost becomes institutionalized. It almost becomes like this is just the way it is. And again, that could be simplistic, oversimplification, but it is why we're going to lead to a reformation where there's an emphasis on every Christian is a saint, every Christian is called to live a godly life, every Christian is supposed to live out their faith. They're supposed to have a genuine faith that works through love. Everything that the New Testament says, all that the New Testament says is not addressed to one class of Christian. It's addressed to everybody who is baptized, names the name of Christ, who claims to have an eternal inheritance with God. And then the book wants to talk about the monastery at Cluny. Again, in every age there have been true Christians, page 95 of your book. Okay. Christ is always fulfilling his promise. Now, William the Pious, the Duke of Aquitaine, which is a province in southeastern France, he decides to give his favorite hunting grounds to these monks in the early 10th century when there's kind of spiritual darkness spreading through the land. And he allowed them to choose their own leaders. So here's a book by Steve Tompkins, Short History of Christianity. William concluded that what had most compromised monasteries was political interference and entanglement. So his grand innovation was to give the monks complete freedom to choose their leaders. So again, this whole notion of lay investiture was affecting the monasteries as well as the bishoprics. And William says, no, I'm going to let you develop your own discipline, pick your own leaders. You know who's best qualified to do this. I'm not going to influence it. And again, there's often positive things about that. And there certainly was positive things in this Cluniac movement and reform, but sometimes that wasn't so positive, because sometimes the lay leaders would recognize when there's a lot of corruption, particularly in the papacy. 50 years later, you're going to have Otto the first Holy Roman Emperor, depose or attempt to depose a very corrupt pope who was fathering children and not living up to any sort of vow of celibacy. So after this decline in the 9th century among the monasteries, there's a great renewal that happens. So again, even though there's problems with monasticism, God used it in various ways to help not only people who became monks, but also the communities in which they lived, to sort of be visible, um, local manifestations of how a Christian is supposed to live. Again, there's some systemic problems that it doesn't end up leading to perhaps the kind of positive influence that we would like it to have, but that doesn't mean that it was totally negative. So here's a map of where Cluny is. You can see it's not too far from the border of Switzerland. Geneva is a little bit to the east there. And this just kind of shows you different Cluniac monasteries that starts. So you've got all kinds of Benedictine monasteries all over the place and Augustinian ones. Well, now you've got ones that are influenced by this new Cluniac movement. And then here's a picture of the Abbey of Cluny, and it exists still today. Now, obviously, it didn't look like this when it was first given by William of Aquitaine. This is a couple of centuries later. I think this is around the end of the 11th century or maybe the 12th century. So you can see just incredibly, there's a lot of wealth that you can see there, and a lot of success, at least institutionally, in what they were doing. And again, this wasn't the only one. They had a huge influence. It was this Cluny movement which produced the great Hildebrand. He's going to come along a couple of centuries later in the early 13th century. All right, so you need to outline here. I'm going to put up a chapter 14 lecture here pretty soon. So you got to outline chapters 13 and 14 this week, and then you'll have a quiz on Friday. And it will be kind of a combination of chapters 13 and 14. So you'll want to make sure that you know both of these chapters well. Thank you.